Hello and welcome to Mass Media Talk. It's another lovely day at BYU Idaho, right? And got Brian and Stacy here to talk to you a little bit about that. Today, actually, we're taking on what would be the mass audience individual perspective, so how we perceive the media. And I love this. The beginning of our chapter talks about exposure is not the same as attention, which we all can understand that as we drive down the street, there's a gazillion billboards. We walk through a building and there's posters and there's music playing. And sometimes we have no idea or we don't notice it, or it's there so frequently that it becomes wallpaper. We don't even pay attention to it. So let's talk about this a little bit. What do you think, Stacey? So we got these different states of exposure. Do you want to take that on first? What do you think we should jump into?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we've got physical, perceptual, and psychological criteria that we really do have to pay attention to. The physical criterion, let's see. I'm trying to think of a good example for that, Brian.
Oh, this is interesting. So we talk about being physically someplace. So we're physically exposed to a message. Here's one that I use all the time. So let's take this one on. So someone says that they're telling you a story, okay? Or, this doesn't work as well for physical, but they're telling you a story. They say, a dog was run over by a car. It's like, oh, that's tragic, right? And so we get this perception in the psychological, right? So my background baggage is every dog that I've ever had have been huge. Great Danes, giant dogs. So when I'm thinking about a dog's run over by a car, I'm seeing a Great Dane and I'm thinking a car like a sedan or something like that. Someone else might hear the same story and they're thinking Chihuahuas, and then they're thinking monster trucks. And someone else might hear the story and they're thinking Labradors and Yugos, So
True.
all these things go into how we perceive and our psychological, maybe we hate dogs. So it's like, so psychologically, this is no tragedy. Maybe we love animals. And so
That's true.
psychologically, I'm devastated. Or maybe I'm a car lover. And so I'm more concerned about the car. So there could be 10 of us hearing the same story and we all perceive it differently. But we're all physically there hearing the story. You have to actually be physically there so you can have the other two in this particular set scenario. So that's always kind of fun. What I do sometime in class, we'll go down and say, okay, everyone picture a dog in your mind, and everyone tells me what dog there is in their mind. And there's always some connection, right? It's a dog you had growing up, or I
Yes,
saw a commercial with the dog.
absolutely.
Or what car are you thinking of? Well, I drive this car, or it's my dream car. So none of those things just come out of the air. They're from our background. Our perceptions come from past experiences. And so one of the things that we'll talk about a little later is being able to analyze why we think the way we do. Why, when you say dog, do I see a Chihuahua and you see a Great Dane? So, well, it has to do with our background and what our experiences are. So this is really interesting when you think about that. What else would you bring up on this one, Stacy? It's really interesting.
I was just thinking about our assignment that we're doing this week about
Hmm.
the two different news stories covering trailer parks and
Yeah.
how we all come into, watching these two news stories and we have our own perception of a trailer park. And it's been interesting over the years reading students' perceptions on, from growing up near trailer parks, or maybe their grandparents lived in a trailer park, or maybe there was a trailer park near them that had a bad reputation, or maybe they had really good friends in a trailer park and they always had positive thoughts about them. But all of those things weigh in when we start to see a news story or see something on social media about a particular subject that colors our view of whatever that topic is. And it's just important that we're aware of that. This is perfect to maybe bring this up at this time, but the National Association for Media Literacy Education has a yearly Media Literacy Week, and that just happens to be this week. And so today, we're recording this on Tuesday, but today's focus is on analyzing messages. And so thinking about, the 7 basic questions, right? Who, what, where, when, why, and how. Who made this? When was it made? Who paid for it? What is left out that I might need to know or do some more research on? What techniques are being used? And I think those are some things that now that you have a little bit of background on advertising that we've been talking about the last 2 weeks, and the vowels typology, you have a little bit more to draw from when you're analyzing media messages. And So those are some things that we can think about too, and how they affect our perception, the different techniques that are used to get our attention.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that kind of leads into, when we talk about attention, book this week talks about exposure states. We've got the automatic
Yes.
state. We've got a state where we're completely, transported, attentional state. So, in the old exposure state, this is interesting because, back in the day when, they still do radio and TV ratings, but, back used to do ratings books where you're supposed to watch and then report it, right? And that's, the quote on that one, it was the worst system out there except for all the rest because there was no other way to do it, right?
Yes.
Radio was really interesting because how do you write that down if you're trying to track down for advertise? How do I know? So they came up with these little devices where they'd have certain people carry them around, and it would analyze all the audio they were exposed to. So all the radio stations would have a certain frequency or code embedded in them, so it would know if you'd been exposed to that particular radio station, which is wonderful. But exposure doesn't mean attention, right? So you think about
Yes.
this, how many times do you go to a restaurant? You go to Applebee's, right? And they got TVs playing everywhere. And if you had that device, it would probably pick up a football game or a bunch of other
Yeah.
things. You're not paying attention at all. You're paying attention to your conversation or your chicken wings or whatever you're eating, right? So
So
I think it's
true.
an interesting thing to talk about. We are exposed to a lot of things, but not all exposures have the same impact.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's an important point that the chapter makes at the very beginning, that being exposed to a message has to fall into the physical, perceptual, and
Yeah.
psychological criteria. So just being aware of that. And Brian, you and I before this were talking about the self-reflexive state. And
Yeah.
that's the highest state that we're in, where we're hyper aware of the message. We're thinking carefully about how that message is impacting us. And I frequently, as students analyze their different states that they're in for one evening, as our project is this coming week, a lot of students say, wow, I realize I'm not very often in a self-reflexive state. And so I think it's just important to be aware of that state and find more time that you can think more carefully about the messages that you're being exposed to, why a certain message is getting your attention and keeping your attention, why it's making you think or feel a certain way. And, ultimately, as we've talked about with the winners and losers, in economics, how is that playing out with how you're spending your time and your money too?
Yeah. Yeah. And we always have a good conversation on the subliminal. That's always fun because some people are firmly entrenched thinking that subliminal works. According to this definition, if it's not perceived, it's not going to have an impact on you. So,
Yeah.
by definition, subliminal probably is not happening. But if there's something we can perceive, so there can be stuff, images that we can see and have suggestions, lyrics and music, that kind of thing. Backmasking, probably not, because you really can't perceive it. You have to play the record backwards to hear it. So probably not going to. Our minds probably not that good. So I wouldn't be too concerned about being, brainwashed by subliminal messages. We have enough messages blasting us everywhere that it's probably more the exposure state where we're just,
Yeah.
in this automatic state, and we get exposed to some. And it's like I mentioned last week, at election time, we might go into the voting booth and vote for somebody just because we saw their names and we really weren't paying
Exactly.
attention. We just saw it so many times. And advertising, this is a pretty good thing. That's why you get a lot of saturated advertising. It's the whole top of mind, right? You hear something enough, and then when it comes to purchase it, then it's the first thing that comes to your mind, whether it's good or not, right? I had that happen to me. I walked into Walmart looking for some stain, and I'm looking around and I see a brand and said, oh, that's a good one. And then I got self-reflexive because of this class. And I said, wait, why do I think that's a good one? And I had to think, because I've seen it advertised and the advertising says it's good. So is it really good? I don't know, but the advertising says it was. But I caught myself thinking, oh, that's the only reason I think it's good. I don't know. I don't have any evidence. I haven't tried them out. It's just the advertising told me so. And I think if we get in that state, then we can start to think, oh, we become, media literate just means we aren't used by the media. We can use it. So, for our benefit, right? So, I bought
Yes.
some stain. Do I remember if it worked well? Yeah, just like any other stain, right? I wasn't transported into some great life or anything like that because of it. But I think I think the self-reflexive is a good part. If we find ourselves in a situation like that, step back and say, why do I think the way I do?
Yeah. And that's so important, whether it's like you mentioned, election coverage or even a news story in particular, any really highly debatable topic. I think we really do have to take off our blinders and, look at how maybe have conversations with family and friends about why they feel the way that they do, trying to understand where different people are coming from. And that doesn't mean that you have to change your opinion about that. But I think the less that we can, be so focused on what we think is right, the better off this world will be, certainly. Just being more respectful of other people's opinions. And that really comes down to the basis of media literacy, right?
Sure, sure.
Not being stuck in one particular
Yeah,
aspect of something, being able to look at different points of view and perspectives.
yeah,
Um,
I agree.
yeah.
Well, I think even from, we're talking about from a religious perspective, media exposure, for the strength of youth, it really steps back and says you need to pay attention to when you feel a spirit. And when you feel a spirit, then whatever you're doing, it's probably an okay experience, right? If you're exposed to media and you're not feeling the spirit, or you're feeling some other type of spirit, that's probably not good. So that's, good to be self-reflexive. If you're listening to a certain genre of music and, plenty of great music out there, but if you find yourself consistently wandering somewhere you shouldn't be, or not being able to feel a spirit with you, we had this conversation once in a class, and one student says, man, if I have to be able to feel the spirit with every media, what can I actually watch? So, well, maybe you need to reframe. It's not talking about you feel like you do when you're partaking of the sacrament, but probably just that your mind's open and your mind isn't going places it probably shouldn't, and you're open to positive, invitations from the spirit. And so, yeah, can you watch a funny movie? Yes. If it's, could an R-rated movie be okay? Maybe. Depends what's in it, right? Because that used to be the letter of the law. Don't watch R-rated movies. So, well, this PG-13 one's got a bunch of sex and violence, but it's not R, so I'm going to watch it, and I'm good, right? But this one
That's
actually
true.
takes more of a self-reflexive state. What's happening to me when I watch this? And that could be different for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Sometimes something might trigger something in someone and say this isn't appropriate for me, which wouldn't trigger something in somebody else. And so it's really, even from a religious perspective, I think this is really important for our media exposure to think about what we're watching, reading, listening to, and what impact it has on us, and where does it take us.
So true. And I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because I feel like anymore ratings are a big guessing game for all of us. You never know.
That's
You
right.
could watch a rated R movie and it might be worse or better than some of the PG-13s out there, or some of the mature programming that you can find on streaming services. So it really does. Love that you pointed out that we really do need to pay attention to whether or not we're feeling the spirit when we're watching it, and let that be our guide. Um, and I do think it's also okay to explore other uh, schools of thought, other ideas that, like I said, you may not necessarily agree with, but I think it's important to understand where other people are coming from, whether or not you agree with them too.
Yeah, yeah. Good to have understanding and listen, and not just put up the barriers. And that kind of gets to that. Let's talk about this filtering business, because I think we do a lot of that. I know for sometimes if I hear something in particular that I don't agree with, my automatic reaction might be just to shut it down completely. And that's not always a bad thing, but and sometimes it is, because as you're talking about, if we filter out every message that is contrary to our basic beliefs, then we limit the understanding we might have of where that person or that group is coming from, even if we continue to disagree. Um, obviously some filtering things, if it's overly crass or something like that, obviously,
For
okay,
sure.
I'm gonna filter that out. But if it's an opposing opinion, I think that's one of the problems we run into currently is as opposing opinions are meant to be fighting words. We got to defend our territory as opposed to having a good discussion. So but we filter out a lot of things, and it's good that we do, because like we talked, we walk down the hall and there's posters everywhere. If we had to stop and analyze each one every time we walked by it, that would be a problem. We'd never get down the
We wouldn't.
hall. What do you want to take on with this filtering? We got filtering, meaning matching, and then construction of meanings. Anything you want to take on there?
That's a great question. I did want to bring up transported state really
Okay. Oh,
quickly.
let's talk about that first. Yeah.
I I I think that we've all been in this state before. I think it's a really interesting state because when anyone that's played a video game with the headset on and you're just really engrossed in what's happening, you have no idea what's going on around you. Or if you're in a theater and you're watching a show that you're really into, and you're not even, you don't even know what your neighbor's doing or what's going on in the rest of the theater. It's
Yeah.
just you and the screen. So I think that we can also find, as you and I were talking about, people on their phones too. Sometimes, we might be scrolling on social media, or we might be watching YouTube videos and not even have any idea of what's going on around us. And I think too often maybe we tune out the rest of the world
Mm.
when we're on our phones. And do you remember that General Conference talk about, it was from a sister, and she talked about how when she was in line at the grocery store, she was going to pick up her phone, and but then she decided to put her phone away and paid attention, and ended up having a conversation with someone in line with her. And I can't remember if she bought him groceries or something, but I think just paying attention, especially when we're talking about in a gospel sense, we might find more opportunities to serve and love and just uplift those around us when we're not so engrossed in what's happening on our screens.
Yeah, and I think it's when, transported state is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we pay good money to go to a movie because that's what we want. When we're in that movie for those 90 minutes, if we're not transported, it was a bad movie, right? Because like,
That's
you're looking at the
true.
poor acting, the bad editing, or your feet are stuck to the floor because somebody spilled a soda or whatever it is. But if you're always in a transported state, and video gaming is where we get that telescoping thing, right? Because you're
Yes.
transported, and then you get to the next level, and you get to the next level, and you get to the next level, and 5 hours later, you don't realize you haven't eaten, right? And that's where it can start to get dangerous on anything. It could
Yes.
be, music could be that way. But video games are especially designed that way. And so if you don't have some, stop gaps to figure out, okay, I'm never going to get my homework done. I'm neglecting my family. And this happens a lot actually with young marrieds. Just because you get married doesn't mean you're going to give up your video game habit. It's like, some husband and wives are very disturbed that, either one or the other is spending 5 hours playing video games, and they're sitting there watching them. That's not so much fun. So there is part of it that's good, but just like you said, again, this is where the self-analysis comes in. So
Yes.
when am I ever in a transported state? Is that good or bad? Sometimes it's neither good nor bad. Sometimes it's the amount of time and what we're doing with our time. So we can kind of say, okay, great. I totally watched that movie for 2 hours. It was fantastic. And now I'm actually going to talk to some real people. Maybe we'll talk about the movie.
So true. Yeah, I think, yeah, right. I mean, moderation in all things, right? Trying
Yeah.
not to be in any one of these states all the time is probably a really good thing. Yeah, filtering and meaning matching and meaning construction, these are all really important terms. And there are a couple of communication theories I thought of. I won't go into those, but yeah, meaning, we assign meanings to different messages that we receive. And using our media literacy skills, we can help kind of break those apart, realize, okay, why did I assign that particular meaning to that, that subject or that
Yeah.
idea? And is that really true? Is that something I could maybe do some more research on? Is that something I could talk to someone that might have a differing point of view and try to understand where they're coming from?
Yeah.
And so I think just, it talks a little bit about focusing and our own knowledge structures, building those up a little bit, and maybe looking at where we are weak in those different knowledge structures that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So
Yeah.
the really good, just good information to be aware of, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess I jumped the gun a little bit. That reminds me of the dog and the car thing, because that's meaning construction. But I had two thoughts on that one. We're driving down the street, we look up, we see the giant golden arches. I don't even have to tell you what that means, right? Because now we know giant golden arches. Everybody knows at McDonald's. Now the difference is, a 5-year-old might look at that and say, "Woohoo! Let's stop there. Let's give McDonald's one a Happy Meal." Someone who
Yes.
maybe is a little bit older, a little bit jaded on fast food might say, "Ugh. McDonald's. That's the last place I want to stop." And so now those golden arches have very different meaning for two people. Somebody says, oh, that's awesome. Others say, no, not so great. So it can mean, different things to different people. But I think in a religious context, I think President Nelson has really tried to change our perception of repentance, because
Mm,
for a long time, repentance meant pain. It meant I'm giving up. I have to go and confess these awful, horrible things. But he's changed it to say, no, every day. And that doesn't mean, we're getting, obviously there can be some awful, horrible things, but it's, no, this is a good experience. We're
yeah.
actually having a much, well, a happier experience, because now we're free from these things. And so they have
Yes.
connotation, because I think for a lot of us, growing up, we talk about repentance like, oh, that's what you do when bad people have to repent, right? Because they've done really bad
Yes.
things. They've killed
So
people, they've
true.
done whatever. But it said, no, it's just a change of reframing. So when you hear that word, you don't automatically go into defensive mode. It's like, oh, that's a scary thing. Instead, it's
Yeah.
like, oh, no, that's actually a good thing, and have a positive experience with it.
That's a great point. And I love President Nelson and the way that he has talked about that and just being on the covenant path, right? Improving ourselves every day, trying every day to be a little bit better and more like our Savior. So I think that's a fantastic relation to the gospel there.
Yeah. Oh man, there's a lot of other things on there. What else? Anything else you want to take on
I
here? We've got
know.
analyzing decisions, conceptual differentiation. That sounds like it's going to put somebody to sleep, right? But no, not all. Don't worry about the names, because they all have really cool, descriptions of what they're all about, kind of thing.
I think
Um,
emotional intelligence is kind of a buzzword these days.
yeah, it is.
We talk a little bit more about, how maybe our IQ isn't everything, and the way that we perceive things and our emotional reactions to things. And so I think being media literate, part of that is building a little bit of emotional intelligence and not letting our emotions get in the way of recognizing when there's misinformation or when something is, maybe not
Yeah.
accurate, being able to do some research, take a minute before you react and before you share. I have a dear friend who all through the pandemic and all through the election, our last presidential election, shared all kinds of things that were so blatantly false, and she did it out of emotion. She did it because these things that she was reading got her so fired up and angry, and I think that is how a lot of misinformation is spread. And so I think if we just take a few minutes, use our emotional intelligence, realize, this is the point. This is what they're trying to do. They're trying to get me upset. And realizing that we can exercise some self-control, we can do some research, make sure that this is actually true and accurate
Mhm.
before we share it, before we post it, whatever it is, before we have that conversation with family and friends. I think it will make the world a better place.
Yeah, and that happens on, we talk about both sides of the political aisle, and I think that's a misnomer, because, that's an easy, like, oh yeah, there's two sides. No, there's not. There's like 100 sides. And so there's a varying,
Yes.
degrees in between. So if you try to go
Yes.
far left, far right, in your middle, well, it's like a giant, star of 5,000 points. We're all have a lot of different spectrums. So it just makes it easier, just kind of like putting the black hat on the cowboy. He's the bad guy, right? So you say
Yeah.
someone's left or right, then we automatically categorize it. And it goes exactly with what we're talking about here.
So
If you use
true.
a little bit of a emotional intelligence, it talks about having a little bit more empathy. Why is that happening? A great example recently. So I'm a big BYU football fan, really enjoy it. They were doing great, and then they started to tank, right? So they lost to a team that really badly, and suddenly social media lights up. Fire the coach! Fire the coach! They're terrible!
Mm,
They're terrible! Where 3 weeks earlier is like, oh, they're world beaters because they were ranked and all those kind of things. And so you get this empathy gets lost, and you start getting
yeah.
this mob mentality, and then people start to reacting just like you said by emotions, and we'll see what happens. But it happens in sports all the time. Calling for the coach, telling the players are awful.
That's true.
Everyone's a great coach, when they've never been paid to do it. Um, but yeah, people jump on that bandwagon. So, the empathy thing I think is a big deal. That plays back to a lot to emotional intelligence, how we can see something, understand it, and be perfectly fine with where we stand, but also look and say, okay, I need to have some empathy towards someone else's situation. That doesn't mean that you, again, have to agree with it. You just don't try and, run them out with pitchforks. which often happens, right?
Oh, so too often in today's world. And, in our cancel culture
Mm,
world that we live in, where, you say or do one wrong thing and that's it.
yeah, yeah,
That's
that's it.
you're banned from society.
Man for
So,
life. Yeah. Well, I think
yes.
if one thing you could get out, and I don't know about Stacy, but analyzing. So, kind of like my staying scenario. Just every once in a while, step back, and that's what we're trying to do this week. Why did we make some of the decisions that we do? And so you kind of analyze what
Yeah.
state you're in. Am watching TV? Am I ignoring everybody else, or is the TV on and I'm actually ignoring the TV? So it's just there, but I'm not messaging and getting across. And you don't have to think about it all the time, but certainly at certain points, think, okay, what impact and why do I do that? Why do I scroll on my phone? Why do I walk out of class and automatically pick up my phone and start scrolling? Is it because I want to know what's going on? Because it's a habit? Is it a defensive mechanism so I don't have to talk to people because I'm a little bit
Mm,
shy? Why am I doing that? And if I didn't do that, what are the alternatives? What am I missing out on, kind of thing? If I'm, gaming and I've got 10 friends I game with all the time, I've got a great friendship, is that okay? Or if I don't do that, what's the alternative? Am I missing something, or is this perfectly fine? Because now I've got great friends. I game with them 5 hours a day and we're great buddies because we chat all the time while we're gaming. Is that good or bad? I don't know. Some people automatically put a value on it because how can you waste 5 hours a day gaming? But then, somebody has, card night and they play 5 hours with their buddies,
that's
doing
true.
cards and eating chips is that any different? I don't know. But that's where it's good to step back and say, okay, am I a net winner or a net loser from this particular
Yes.
scenario? And if I'm perfectly happy with it, great. Maybe you need someone else's perspective as well. Maybe that's why you need a spouse to tell you, stop playing games for 5 hours a day or something, or turn off
It's
that
so
football game
true. It's
in
so
my
true.
case.
Yeah, and just thinking finally about the automatic state, just one more thought. I know just my own daughter, she's a sophomore in high school, and I have heard, just read in a lot of student papers that she's not unusual, but always has her AirPods in, always listening to music while, texting friends, while trying to do homework, while trying, and just, maybe take some time to just take a break from it all and find some solitude and silence.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's good to, I think that can also lead you to a more self-reflexive state too, to just have a moment to ponder and not be so constantly inundated with all kinds of mass media that are coming at you all the time.
Ooh, we should set that as a challenge to have everybody say, okay, let's not overdo it. Let's take 30 minutes. You can spare 30 minutes, unplug the headphones, turn everything off, just sit and, think about something and see what happens. See if you hate it. See if it's like, oh, I can't do that. It's too, or maybe just analyze, oh man, why am I so anxious? I've got 30 minutes and after 5 minutes, I can't hardly stand myself. What's going on? Or maybe it's like,
Yeah.
oh, that's kind of deep relief. It's kind of a breath of fresh air. Be interesting to see how different people react to 30 minutes of, just downtime without any electronic, without any, outside impulse, whatever. You're just sitting there with yourself. Might be
I'm
tough.
down. I'm totally down, Brian. I'm going to try it this week. I'll
Okay.
report back
Yeah.
next
I,
week in our podcast how
I
that
can
goes.
already tell you what's going to happen with me. 5 minutes in, I'm going to fall asleep.
I'll probably be right there with you.
Stacy, always fun talking with you. So next week, I got to flip ahead. What is next week? We're talking about, content, all the genres, different types of movies, TV, music, and from a programming and a narrative and all that kind of stuff. That's always fun. We start to categorize different things. So we get into video games next week as well,
Yes.
which is always a blast. I have content experts. I've got my son to talk to about video games. So if
I
I
have my
can,
husband to talk to. Yes.
yeah, if I can get his headphones off and talk to him, maybe we'll try that 30 minutes with him and see
I
what we
was
get.
going to say maybe he would take the challenge too.
I don't know how well it would be received, but we can try it. Cool. Thanks, Stacey. We'll catch up
Thanks
with
so
everybody
much,
next week.
Brian.
Yeah,
All
we'll see
right.
you.
See you later.